Hi, and welcome back to this Wednesday edition of Focal Point AFR Talk. Glad to have you weigh in on the topic of spanking and corporal punishment, what to me is a very surprising ruling from this California appeals court that spanking with a wooden spoon is not a form of child abuse. This is like a virtual mantra on the left. And it's surprising to find this voice of sanity in an appeals court in the state of California. One more verse from the Proverbs on the subject. This is Proverbs 29:15. The rod, and we used the rod. We used the spoon. That was our rod because we did not want them to associate the discipline with our hand. That's why we used a neutral object. And, that's all we'd have to say. I mean, they knew we meant business. If we would say, do you want me to get the spoon, man, their eyes would get wide and, man, they would shape up like in a New York minute because they knew we weren't fooling around. Now, Proverbs 29:15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. You think about these kids out there that are getting in trouble with the law and, we don't always stop and think, even in their 20s, they're involved in violence or they're involved in some kind of drug activity, get in trouble with the law, they wind up behind bars. We don't often stop to think that behind that child, there's a mother somewhere that's grieving. Her heart is broken over what's happened to her child, over what's happened to her son. It is broken. She grieves. She cries herself to sleep at night. She has trouble sleeping because she is so deeply burdened at the way her child has turned out. And that's the point that the proverb is making. I mean, if you spank a child, it's not going to guarantee that they turn out right. It's not saying that. There's no guarantees in life. But you can virtually guarantee that a child that is never disciplined growing up is going to wind up making bad choices as an adult because they are used to getting away with misbehavior. And so it says, look, if parents, you want to give yourself the best shot at being a proud parent of your child when they are adult children, you need to learn to discipline them appropriately while they are young. But back to the story just for a second. The court said that the Santa Clara County Department of Social Services had violated Gonzalez's rights, that's the mother, violated her rights by disregarding parents' authority to discipline their children and by refusing to allow testimony by the daughter who disputed many of the social worker's accusations against her mother. So the social worker drags the mom into court and attributes certain statements or accusations to the daughter. The daughter said that's not the way it went down. That's not what happened. And the social worker would not allow the daughter's testimony into court. And the court naturally found that an egregious violation of the parents' rights. And that's one of the huge problems that I have with social services and child protective services. I mean, it's not that they don't have a place and there aren't good things that they do, but the threat that they represent to parental rights is frightening to me. I mean, they can get an anonymous complaint. They can come into your home and take your child away from you. You never know who made the complaint. You never know what the complaint was about. You don't even know what the complaint was because they're not allowed to tell you. And so I've had parents in my church that have had this happen to them. Had a child protective services show up and want their kids with completely on the basis of an anonymous tip. That violates everything about our justice system. I mean, one of the critical principles of our justice system is that you have the right to face your accuser in open court. These people never know who it is. I mean, that's what they do in communist countries where they're re-education camps. That's the way they do things in those countries. And so you got a lot of this totalitarianism that's crept into our child protective services. Let's see. Neither the department nor the Superior Court judge who upheld his finding that Gonzalez had abused her daughter gave any weight. So there was a judge that had ruled in favor of the social services. This was child abuse. So it was overturned by an appeals court. And this appeals court, 3-0 unanimous ruling, complained that the lower court had not given, quote, any weight to the right of a parent to impose reasonable discipline on his or her child. And they published this as a precedent for trial courts statewide. So this appeals court says, look, we want this opinion to get out there. We want other appeals courts to know about this ruling, to read this ruling, so that they can give full weight to the right of parents to appropriately discipline their children. And for it to be child abuse, you've got to show some kind of intent to bruise. And this court said, look, there was no evidence that the parents intended the daughter to be bruised. They just wanted her to do her homework. They wanted her to hang out with a better class of friends. They wanted her to stop lying to her parents. They wanted her to go to class. They wanted her to do homework. This wasn't about bruising the child. This was about trying to protect the child from her own folly. After a warning, Gonzalez said, this is the mother, the parents spanked her, first the father with his hand, then the mother 5 or 6 times, on one occasion with a wooden spoon, which she said she used because she was too small and weak to do it by hand. She said the girl had been fully clothed when she was spanked, so there was some protection, some padding there. A social worker later quoted the daughter as saying her mother had forced her to take off her clothes and bend over, an account the girl has emphatically denied in a sworn declaration. So this means this Child Protective Services person basically, in my mind, is responsible for perjury here because they refused to allow sworn testimony that would have exonerated the mother, refused to allow that to come into court. I mean, there's whole principles of discovery. I realize it's not a criminal case, but there are whole principles of discovery and stuff like that. You have got to allow all that information. Any evidence you have that would tend to be exculpatory in favor of the defendant, you've got to allow that to come into court if you're acting as an agent of the state. The appeals court said the child abuse law does not apply to parents who act out of genuine disciplinary motives, have a reasonable occasion for discipline, and use only reasonable force. Rushing also noted that the hearing officer who refused to let the daughter testify had later rejected her version of events. That was unfair, the justice said, to both the girl and her mother, upon whom he intended to fasten a lifetime stigma as a child abuser. Now, if this social worker had been able to get away with this, despite the fact that the daughter, who's supposed to be the victim in all this, daughter said that is not the way it went down. She disputed that in sworn testimony. The social worker did not allow that testimony to come before the lower court judge, and realized if he'd been successful, then those parents, or that mom in particular, would have been tagged for the rest of her life as a child abuser. And who knows what the implications would have been for her in terms of employment and other sorts of things. So anyway, kind of a surprising, to me, development, and that this would come out of the state of California is kind of a mind blower. 888-589-8840 is the number to call, 888-589-8840. If you would like to weigh in on that, particularly on the subject of child discipline. And, we talked at the open of the program today about the fact that you've got the president of Russia. Number again is 888-589-8840. You have the president of Russia who is out there saying, look, we need to recover and recapture our Christian identity as a nation. There are a system of values that are a part and parcel of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a Christian nation. And we need to honor those values. We need to respect those traditions. We need to recapture that spiritual center as a nation. One of the things, and he talked later in his comments about reproduction, that, and that's part of the reason they're cracking down on homosexual propaganda. That's why it's against the law to propagandize teenagers into homosexual behavior. Why? Because you cannot procreate. It is biologically impossible for homosexuals to conceive children. So you can't get offspring. If you lionize homosexuality, you normalize it, you say this is a perfectly acceptable variant to heterosexuality, you're going to start running out of people. You're going to start running out of children. And see, Russia's got a huge problem. Their population is actually shrinking, 750,000 people a year. They use abortion as a form of birth control. They're beginning to realize how they've devastated their nation. Their future is looking bleak. They've got an aging population. They don't have young people to work and to care for and to provide and to pay taxes to take care of older people. So they've got a huge problem. And to their credit, they're waking up to it. They're aware of it. And they're trying to do some mid-course correction. So I'd love to see what you think about the fact that you got a president of Russia is far more friendly toward Christianity than the president of the United States. Who would have ever thought? I mean, ladies and gentlemen, who would have ever thought that a day like that would come when the president of the former communist Soviet Union is more friendly toward Christianity than the president of these United States? Let's go to the phones. Let's start with Mike in Mercer, West Virginia. Mike, welcome to Focal Point with Brian Fisher. What's on your mind?
Well, I was going to weigh in on the discipline.
Yes, sir.
Question.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. It's kind of a funny story. My father told me when he was a child, this would have been around 1916, 1915, that he and his older brother got into his father's cigars. They lived up in the mountains in Arizona, and it was a cold morning. The dad came home, and when they heard the door open, they both flipped their cigars into the fireplace. But it wasn't cold enough to have a fire. So the grandfather came in and smelled the smoke. I said, "Have you boys been smoking?" Dad said, his brother said, No, we haven't been smoking. Here's these two smoldering cigars. Dad broke down in tears, started screaming and crying. Yes, we were smoking, and I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. I looked at my uncle and says, "Were you smoking?" "No, I wasn't." So he takes the rod to him. After he's through, he said, "Now, do you understand why you got a spanking?" And through tears, he said, "Yes, because you thought I was smoking." Now, this is kind of what I see that this president we've got is like.
Yeah.
He doesn't get it.
Yeah. All right, Mike. Well, listen, I appreciate the call. And, interesting to make the connection. A lot of people have said, look, we're being governed right now by a 5-year-old who is throwing temper tantrums. Somebody needs to bend him over their knee and paddle him with the Board of Education. Focal Point, AFR Talk, back in 2.